Hello, welcome to our Introduction to Genetics. We'll be talking about the role that genes play in forming your physical development, starting with your prenatal development within the womb, then infancy, early childhood, middle childhood, all the way to older adulthood. Each cell in your body consists of 23 pairs of chromosomes, and those chromosomes carry the genetic instructions for making your physical body. You inherited half of those chromosome pairs from your biological father, from the sperm, and the other half of the chromosome pairs from your biological mother, from the ovum. When the sperm and the ovum came together, that formed the first single cell that represented you, and it's referred to, that cell, as a zygote, which is Greek meaning to yoke together. So that cell is then the first physical representation of you, and as the environment is conducive to development, it then went from one cell to the 5 trillion cells that now represent who you are. The egg and the sperm, that is the ovum and the sperm, are referred to as gametes. They're unusual in that they do not have 23 pairs, but have only 23 chromosomes. And when they come together, as mentioned, that's when you get the 23 pairs of chromosomes. There are a few other cells in the body that don't have all 23 pairs as well, like red blood cells would only have half, likewise, one member from each pair. Here's an illustration of these chromosomes underneath the electron microscope. And one of the things that might become apparent is that some chromosome pairs are longer than others. And these chromosomes are actually labeled 1 through 22, with the longest one being referred to as chromosome pair 1, and the shortest, that's consistently shortest, that is, referred to as chromosome pair 22. The 23rd chromosome pair, which plays an important role in determining the person's sex, we'll talk about more later on. You're looking here at the DNA that makes up the chromosomes. This chromosome put underneath the electron microscope. This is what you get to see. And the DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, that's where we find all the instruction sets for your physical development. It's the steps of the spiral staircase that contain the instructions for forming you. Here are some just interesting facts, fun facts here. If you were to take the human DNA from a single cell, and remember this cell is so small you can't see with the naked eye. Single cell DNA, you could actually stretch it out 6 feet. So that's a lot of data there in that DNA. The DNA for all cells in your body, those 5 trillion cells, would stretch to the moon and back some 6,000 times. If you were to just lightly scratch your arm, you'd be removing hundreds of cells. And every single one of those cells would have the complete instruction set for how to make a physical copy of you. So, to review, the nucleus of each cell in the body, other than sperm and eggs, that is the gametes, as well as some other cells like red blood cells, contain 23 chromosome pairs. Half the chromosomes came from the biological father, the other half from the biological mother. When they came together, they formed the first cell that had the complete instruction set for making you, referred to as a zygote. And those chromosomes are made up of DNA. Now, each chromosome contains many instruction sets, right? Lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of these instruction sets for regulating your development, for your developing as a human male, a human female, someone with dark hair, someone with dark eyes or light colored eyes. Each of these things is regulated by the genes. A gene is just a meaningful segment on a chromosome. So here's a cartoon rendition of a chromosome, and remember the chromosome is made up of DNA, and each step on that DNA is an instruction set, if you will, and several, or it's referred to as like a base pair. And when you bring together those base pairs that all contribute towards a meaningful outcome, they're referred to as a gene. So a gene, a meaningful segment of the chromosome. The gene might be 2,000 steps, it might be shorter, it might be longer. Interestingly, the ability of whether you can curl your tongue or not is controlled, it's thought, by a single gene. So stick out your tongue. Can you curl it? If you can, you're pretty special. I cannot curl my tongue. My wife can curl her tongue, and several of my kids can curl their tongues. But it's not something that I can do, and practice in the environment is not going to change that. That is based upon the genetics. Genes definitely regulate the development and functioning of an organism. For example, you have the genetics for being a human being. If you had the genetics for being a canary, you would have been quite different, right? So your genes play a huge role in determining your physical characteristics. And when we think about our intelligence, well, that's a huge function of our brain development. And since genes play a major role in our physical development, they're going to play a large role in our intelligence as well, in addition to our risks for certain disorders, such as schizophrenia. But they're not the determining factor 100% in all cases. In fact, it's a lot more complicated and interesting than just that you're a function of your genes. For example, here are two identical twins. They have the exact same genetics from their biological mother and father, and yet you can see that one of the twins is actually taller than the other one. So even when they have the exact, and when I say exact, there could actually be some small differences, but when they have essentially the exact genetics, there can be differences in height, in intelligence, and other characteristics as a function of the environment. But the genes play a major role. Again, you came out as a person, not as a canary. Okay, so we're looking at a chromosome pair here, again a cartoon rendition of it. And as mentioned, the genes are a meaningful segment of the chromosome. And in terms of like the tongue curling, you might have just one of these meaningful segments being responsible for tongue curling. You would have gotten one chromosome from the biological mother and one chromosome from the biological father. In many cases, the instruction set from the biological mother and biological father might be identical, but in some cases it won't be. There might be conflicting instructions. And of course, what happens then? So, here's a question for you. If the biological mother and father can both curl their tongues, will all their children be able to curl their tongues? I also have here if the biological mother and father both have brown eyes, will their children have brown eyes? Tongue curling is determined by one gene. Eye color can actually be influenced by thousands of genes, so it's more complicated. So for now, I'll just stick with the tongue curling. So if mom and dad can both curl their tongues, are we guaranteed that all the kids will be able to curl their tongues? Let's develop some important language to help us to consider this question, this concept. Okay, so here are important terms to be aware of. Homozygous, heterozygous, dominant gene, recessive gene. Homozygous, both genes provide the same instruction. So we have homozygous, homozygous. Heterozygous, the genes provide conflicting instructions. So here is an example of heterozygous, as illustrated by two different colors. The dominant gene. The dominant gene is a gene that always determines development. Recessive gene, the gene is ignored when conflicting instructions are present. So in this cartoon rendition, we have a gene here that's illustrated in an orange color. If that gene is a dominant gene, then the adjacent gene that would have come from the other biological parent would be ignored. So if you have the dominant gene, it's the one that is always followed. Okay, so let's look at our tongue curling example. Here's mom. She can curl her tongue. And notice that we have a dominant tongue curling gene from mom. That's illustrated as an uppercase D. And a recessive gene that would indicate non-tongue curling. And that's illustrated by it being a lowercase. So here's a cartoon rendition of mom's genotype. We see a dominant tongue curling gene and a recessive non-tongue curling gene. Why do we know that the tongue curling gene is dominant? Because when mom is heterozygous, that is when there's conflicting instructions for tongue curling, if the tongue curling gene is present, it's followed. That makes it dominant. Dad, similar. He's able to curl his tongue. He's heterozygous for the trait of tongue curling, but because he has a dominant tongue curling gene, he's able to curl his tongue. Okay, here below them are 4 of their children, hypothetical children, and this represents 4 theoretical possibilities. So in our starting with the left, you have a theoretical possibility that you're going to get the dominant tongue curling gene from mom and the dominant tongue curling gene from dad. This child has 2 dominant tongue curling genes. Is the child homozygous or heterozygous? If you said homozygous, you're correct. Then you have the next child who gets the dominant tongue curling gene from mom, the recessive non-tongue curling gene from dad. But because the dominant tongue curling gene is present, the child can curl his tongue. Similar case with our third child, though here we're getting the non-dominant tongue curling gene from mom and the dominant tongue curling gene from dad. And finally, we got this poor kiddo here who has the recessive non-tongue curling gene from mom and the recessive non-tongue curling gene from dad. Is this child heterozygous or homozygous? If you said homozygous, you're correct because both genes are the same, and he is not going to be able to curl his tongue because he doesn't have the tongue curling gene. So homozygous for the first and the last child in this illustration, and for the 2 kids in the middle, they are heterozygous. So dominant, if at least one of the genes codes for the trait, tongue curling, the trait will be expressed. Recessive gene expressed only if the person is homozygous for the trait. That is double recessive homozygous. This brings up additional terms that you need to be aware of, phenotype and genotype. And again, we need these terms to have a good conversation on this topic. So phenotype, that's the observable trait that's actually seen. So if they say, well, what's a tongue curling gene phenotype, or what's a tongue curling phenotype, they're asking, can the child curl his or her tongue? Genotype, those genes that we carry. I want to go back and just say that our phenotype and genotype won't always match. Right? Sometimes the phenotype is tongue curling. Sometimes the genotype is that there is a dominant tongue curling gene and a recessive one. So just because someone can curl their tongue doesn't mean that both instruction sets for tongue curling. Okay, let's talk next. Another example of a single cell that is a single gene that can have a huge impact on development. That's the one that's responsible for our ability to make use of phenylalanine, an essential acid present in milk and other foods. There is a disorder known as phenylketonuria, and you can see why they abbreviate it as PKU. And as mentioned here, an inherited disorder in which a child is unable to make use of the phenylalanine. Right? So let's look at how the genetics might work behind this disorder. So in this example, the mother carries the recessive PKU gene, and the father does not carry the recessive PKU gene. So in this case, the red P is the recessive gene, and the dark black P is the dominant gene. And because the ability to make use of phenylalanine is dominant, mom can still make use of the phenylalanine, so she can make use of milk and such. Dad can make use of milk and such in terms of his being able to drink the milk and derive the nutrition and such from it. Let's take a look at how their kids might turn out. So mom might contribute either the dominant gene when we have the 23 pairs of chromosomes. A child might get the chromosome with the dominant gene, which would result in all is good, or the child might get the chromosome with the recessive gene that doesn't code for good use of phenylalanine, and then that puts a child potentially at risk. The father is going to contribute, in this example, a gene, a phenylketonuria, a gene that can process that phenylalanine. In either case, both of his chromosomes have it. So if we get the dominant gene from mom and the dominant gene from dad, that child is classified as normal, able to make use of the phenylalanine. If the child gets the dominant gene from mom and the other dominant gene from dad, child number 2, again normal. If the child gets the recessive gene, that is, gets the chromosome with the recessive gene from mom, the child will still at least get a normal gene from dad. That child is a carrier. Carrier meaning that the child does not display the phenotype of one who cannot make use of phenylalanine, but the child has that, if you will, that bad gene within his genetics. And the other child could get the recessive gene from mom and the other dominant gene from dad, in which case that child's a carrier. So if mom's a carrier and dad is, quote, normal, then none of their kids are going to be afflicted, but theoretically half the kids would be carriers, which means that if they married someone else that had the recessive gene, some of their kids could be afflicted. Okay, here's an example of that. So now in this other scenario, mom's a carrier and dad is a carrier, right? Mom carries the recessive PKU gene, dad carries the recessive PKU gene. And here's a theoretical distribution of what types of kids they might have. So mom might contribute the chromosome with the dominant good gene, and dad might contribute the chromosome with the dominant good gene, and that child then comes out normal in terms of PKU. The mom might contribute the dominant gene. The dad might end up contributing the recessive gene that puts the child at risk. And because that child has at least the dominant gene that codes for normal behavior, that child's a carrier. The child might get to the recessive gene from mom and the dominant gene from dad. Again, carrier. Or, and this is that worst case scenario, the child might get the chromosome from mom with the recessive PKU gene on it, and the chromosome from dad with the recessive PKU gene on it, and that child ends up being afflicted with PKU. So notice that we apply these labels, normal, carrier, or afflicted, with PKU, which is a recessive gene, and you have to be double recessive, homozygous, to be afflicted with it. 25% of this couple's kids, on average, will be afflicted with PKU. Now, the thing with PKU is that if you have it and you're drinking the milk and such, it actually builds up deposits in the brain that by around age 18 lead to retardation. So that's the genetic contribution, if you will. The environmental contribution is that someone knows that they have PKU and they avoid these milk products, then they won't see that build up in the brain and their intelligence will remain normal throughout their lifespan. So that's one of the things that you get tested for at the hospital at birth is, do you have PKU? Because if you do, that change to your environment can make all the difference and you'll be able to maintain normal intelligence throughout your lifetime. Okay, what about that 23rd chromosome pair? So as mentioned, there's these 22 chromosomes numbered from the longest chromosome pair to the shortest chromosome pair. They're called the autosomes. Then we have that 23rd chromosome pair, and it's referred to sometimes as the sex chromosomes because they determine one's sex as male or female. You'll notice that for the 23rd chromosome pair, there's an X chromosome and there's a Y chromosome. And not everybody has the XY chromosome. For those that are male, they have the XY chromosome. For those that are female, they have an XX chromosome. And here's how it works. So all the women around us, they have, in the simplistic view, they all have two X chromosomes. And all the men have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. In terms of having children with the ovum and the sperm, the woman is going to contribute, well, either one X chromosome or the other X chromosome. So in either case, all of her children will have one of her X chromosomes. For the biological father, he'll either be contributing an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. So if he contributes an X chromosome, that combined with the mom's X chromosome, and then we have a biological woman that will be developing. If the biological father contributes the Y chromosome, that would be his Y chromosome, and along with the wife's X chromosome, and then we have an XY chromosome, and that will result in a biological man developing. Again, the simplistic view here. So woman's egg is always going to contain X chromosome. The man's sperm will contain either the X or the Y chromosome, and as you can see, that Y chromosome is shorter. Now you got to think about some historical events, like King Henry VIII. As you may recall, he had several wives, and he wanted to produce a son. And because his first wife, he was unable to produce an heir. Well, he ended up having his wives either executed or he divorced them. Totally had huge ramifications for his country and the faith of people in his country and so on. But he blamed his wives and had them beheaded in several instances. Who should he really have had beheaded in this case? Who was, if you will, responsible for the gender or the sex of his child? That's right, that would have been King Henry there. Because the Y chromosome is shorter, that means that for males, they're going to be inheriting some genes on the X chromosome where there is not a matching gene on the Y chromosome. That means that for males, there are some traits that they inherit from their mother, some genes they inherit from their mother, and that is going to determine their development, period. There is no possibility of conflicting instructions inherited from the biological father. Whatever is on the X chromosome from mom, that's what goes. And those are referred to as sex-linked traits. Okay? For some genes on that X chromosome that are responsible for like blood clotting or color vision, if the male inherits a recessive, or if the male inherits a gene from the biological mom that is not a good gene, he's at grave risk. Because, let's say here's a gene that's responsible for blood clotting, and the biological mother contributes this chromosome where blood clotting doesn't happen. That puts the son at, the son will be experiencing hemophilia then, right? Or you get cut and you bleed and there's very little you can do, or it takes a long time for the clotting to eventually take place. Or if the biological son inherits the chromosome from the biological mother for, instead of having good color vision, color blindness. Well, again, there's nothing from the biological father to counteract that, so that's what goes. So let's take a look at how this works in terms of hemophilia and color blindness. So here's mom. Mom's a carrier mother, we'll say, for color blindness. And here's father, and we'll say he's normal father, indicating he doesn't have any of these recessive traits. So here's this 23rd chromosome pair from mom and this 23rd chromosome pair from dad. And the first child in this theoretical example of 4 kids is a normal male, gets the normal chromosome from mom, and gets the X chromosome gets the Y chromosome from dad. So his first child gets the X chromosome from mom, the Y chromosome from dad. XY, we have a normal male. Okay, this next example, we get the good chromosome from mom here. By good, I mean has that good gene. And we get the X chromosome from dad. Again, or in this case, it's an XX for a 23rd chromosome. We have a normal female. Now we have a child that gets the X chromosome from the biological mother with this maladaptive gene, right, for color blindness. And from dad, it gets the Y chromosome. This is going to be an affected male because there's nothing to counteract that color blindness gene. That's the only instruction set, right? Nothing there to counteract it, so the male will be colorblind. And here in this scenario, we have a carrier female who gets the chromosome with the afflicted gene from mom, but gets the good X chromosome from dad. And because normal color vision is dominant, the child displays normal color vision, but is a carrier with that bad recessive gene for color blindness. Okay, I hope that you found this helpful. So again, we got to talk about inheritance of genes and how it works out. Dominant genes, recessive genes, phenotype, genotype. We also talked about the heterozygous and homozygous. Heterozygous meaning different instructions. Homozygous means same. We talked about how that works out with tongue curling as well as with PKU. And then we also talked about sex-linked traits. And this refers to a 23rd chromosome pair where the male has the X chromosome from mom, the Y chromosome from dad, and since that Y chromosome is shorter, some instructions from the mom are simply going to be followed because they are the only instruction that the child has, that the boy has. All right, take care.